right, guys, we're jumping in right into our next panel, and then we're going to have a lunch break. So come on back, have a seat, and we're going to hand it off to Juan. Go.
All right. So, well, thanks everybody for coming. This next panel is going to be about banking and the future of the future of banking with Bitcoin. So, I appreciate all you guys coming on. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. Okay, let's start with you. What do you think? You talked a lot about banking, commercial banking in particular, back in the 1800s and so. Where do you see missing? What do you see missing in the Bitcoin market that banking you think can actually add of value? What's up?
So speak into the mic and check if it's on.
Hello.
Got it.
To me, banking has to develop, or we're going to continue to have these 80 and 90% collections. And until we, like my memory, I would say it's called literally a law.
In the mic.
More like this? Okay. A law scholar. And there's a lot of different views on this, but I do believe that will bring the stability to the marketplace. In other words, there is such a thing as a non-inflation money creation and liquidation that represents all in the marketplace. And until that develops side by side with Bitcoin, I don't see us changing the dynamics, the volatility. I mean, the way Bitcoin is now, I literally say it's sex is cash and it's allowed to store value. And anybody that bought Bitcoin at 60,000 does not think it's a store value. I'm sorry, they don't. And it really does kind of suck at cash. I know, I learned from Jimmy, I use my credit cards because it's the easiest way and I get rewarded for it. And so I think we have a long way to go, and that's where we're going. I want to mention to you guys, we are changing the calendar a little bit. We're going to shorten these sessions and have a longer lunch break tomorrow and do the same thing today starting at noon, and we'll do the same thing tomorrow. So just check the schedule. Our web developer just changed it. So
Yeah, Muzz, let us know when 30 minutes are up, and then we'll take some questions. So at noon, we'll take a few questions and probably end like 10 after, maybe quarter after at most.
All right, so how do you see, because that's an interesting argument that I think is not really in the discussion in general, which is that we think banking can sort of dampen the volatility, in particular the 90% corrections, say like 70% corrections. How would they be doing this? Would there be trading? Maybe Tom can add to this, you probably have more experience.
Yeah, banking is about to change. I mean, the banks are now being pulled in two different directions. You have the central bank digital currencies that are looking to remove private banking altogether to go to a central banking model. And meanwhile, you have Bitcoin pulling the current banking system in a different direction, saying, well, you only can have control of any money because people can now be their own banks. So what becomes the function of a bank? Well, mostly advising services. If people still listen to banks, how to invest their money, lending services. And banks do have, a purpose and a job, and the job is evaluate your credit rating. Like, we're not saying they're good at this job, right? But an entity does assess your ability to borrow money, to start a business, to have a loan. Right now, this is being done in the crypto space with a lot of these lenders, but we all see how that's ending. Banking services will definitely change in the world of Bitcoin. They'll no longer be responsible for your storage. Bitcoin is attacking all these things very slowly. Bitcoin is slowly becoming people's choice for a bank, while the majority of the people aren't responsible enough to be their own bank. So it's possible that central banks will take over all the fiat stuff, and private banks will just say, you know what, screw you. Like JP Morgan will say, why don't we just take our business to only Bitcoin? Like, we don't want to deal with fiat money anymore. We will just manage people's Bitcoin. And that's it. And we don't care about the fiat central banks. You can have your own central bank digital currency. You can hold that for people. And we're going to help people manage their Bitcoin. So that could be another potential avenue for banks. They're private companies. If they hired smart people, they could evolve.
So, before we can really, I think we all agree that for Bitcoin to become a currency, and to be actually be talking about banking intentionally with Bitcoin, the stability needs to come, because there's no reason to spend it if your speculative judgment says it's going to quadruple in the next 3 years or something like that, right? So on the one hand, there's something that needs to happen for Bitcoin to become a currency, and it's probably going to be just more time and more adoption. On the downside, on the price correction, we have dollar cost averaging, with which Aleks you co-founded Amber, right? As an automatic dollar cost averaging service, and it seems likely that this is going to actually catch the correction. If it's likely doing it already, because there's multiple companies automatically doing dollar cost averaging. How do you see this transition towards sort of more stable Bitcoin happening? Maybe other thoughts on that? Yeah, speak quick. No.
Hey, can someone turn on?
I'll just take this one.
So to Tone's point, like banks are private entities that provide value-added services for people who have some level of wealth. So originally banks emerged as these places where you could custody your gold, for example, right? So I think long term what Bitcoin forces is banks to actually move towards being feature-rich, user experience-rich type of experiences. So I used to use an analogy which was the same way you have multiple email clients, like you've got Gmail, you've got Apple Mail, you've got all these new ones. That's the interface through which you communicate on an SMTP or IMAP protocol, right? So the messaging still happens underneath here, but what you're using is a different flavor of product or service that you want to interact with the Bitcoin. So when I look at the future of banking, I look at it as applications that allow you to interact with Bitcoin and might value add in terms of custody, in terms of investment advice, in terms of things like that. Now, that's longer term, right? So we've got two questions here, is how do we go from where we are today, how do we transition, and how do we sort of end up there where banking effectively is just a user experience, like it's an app. That's all, banking becomes a fucking app. It doesn't become a fully integrated institution which issues the money and does all that crap. So in the transition phase, so there's something more that we're doing at Amber now, we're about to roll this out, but fundamentally speaking is we allow people to accumulate Bitcoin on autopilot, you can auto buy the dip, there's all these cool features in there. But what we're now doing next is we're going to attack the fiat system by enabling people to use Amber as a means to pay for things in fiat via the buy now, pay later model. So let's say you need to come to a conference for like, $800 or whatever. Instead of having to sell any Bitcoin or to dump $800 up front, you could buy the ticket with your Amber widget, and then you, with the collateralization that you have of the Bitcoin, you can pay off in fiat in 8 easy installments of $100 over the next 8 months. So what we're doing is we're going to enable people to spend, because it's easier to spend fiat today, not because fiat is superior to Bitcoin, but because more people on the other end accept fiat. So we play that game, and we treat Bitcoin as the pristine collateral that it is. And the interim financial institutions, like what we're doing at Amber, effectively become your partner along your journey of accumulating Bitcoin as the asset, as your treasury, in an individual capacity, and still being able to interact with the fiat system, but never having to sell your Bitcoin. So there's that transition until more and more people, or until a critical mass actually is on a Bitcoin type standard, in which case you won't need to borrow dollars against your Bitcoin to pay for anything because the counterparty will be accepting Bitcoin, in which case we start to transform into more of an application to use your Bitcoin. So there's a transition.
That's really interesting. So I feel like we should clarify what you just said, because I think it's very powerful, and this is where the innovation I see happening. So people are buying Bitcoin with Ammous on a DCA, dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin with Ammous, right? And then that Bitcoin can be collateralized or used as a collateral on a fiat loan to pay for a conference like this one. But you can actually charge people for that loan over time. So you're
Or you can
spreading
give
it
it
out.
for free, and then you just charge the merchant because you're increasing the merchant's conversion.
Wait, say that again?
Or you can just give it to people for free, and you charge the merchant because you're increasing the likelihood of the consumer purchasing something.
The merchant being the conference.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's definitely one of the more interesting parts of this industry right now in terms of banking is the collateralization of Bitcoin and fiat loans. There's a lot of advantages there. There's a lot of compliance and sort of tax advantages on that as well.
You spend the shit money, you keep the good money.
Yeah.
And you avoid taxation.
And you don't get capital gains tax on that either, right? So that's a whole other layer. There's this whole layer of regulatory compliance that Bitcoin is also, colliding with. And obviously we're seeing that in the news right now, big time and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different places we could take this now. I think you touched on custody as well. Jimmy, custody is one of the major sort of reasons why banking exists at all. And it's one of the major things that Bitcoin actually innovates on. Can you talk to that a little bit? Can you speak to custody with Bitcoin and where would you like it to see it go? And are we really going to be our own banks, or is this, because the exchanges are still huge, they're still centralized, there's a lot of centralization. People like custodial services, people like having somebody to call. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so when we think about banking, we have to go back to first principles. Why does banking exist? It's because people don't like securing their own stuff. So securing your own gold bars is very difficult. You have to hide it in a sufficiently hidden place. You can't tell too many people, lest they betray you and take it from you. If you bury it somewhere, you might forget where it is. If you have a treasure map to it, then you might lose it. There's so many ways in which having custody of your own stuff is risky. And honestly, this is something that a lot of people are very uncomfortable doing because they are not very responsible, right? Like they don't like being responsible for their own fate. And it's unfortunate, but that's sort of a general human tendency, is that they want to outsource responsibility to other people. And that was the original function, right? The thing that Bitcoin allows is that security becomes a lot easier because it's not physical, it's digital. And that means that you can back it up, you can have all sorts of processes to make securing it a lot easier, and yet very, very difficult for somebody to go and get. So if you have like 3 or 5 multi-sig with the backups in 5 different vaults, and you have backups also with your relatives and something and things like that, doesn't have sort of like that single point of failure that gold does or cash does or anything physical, because it's in a single place, right? That's the main sort of reason why banks exist. It originally started as a place where you put your gold because you wanted it secured by somebody that knew security. Now we have this ability to secure it ourselves, and that custody aspect is what makes Bitcoin a lot more decentralized. Right now, there are like 7 gold vaults in the world that have most of the world's gold, right? Like there's one in London, one in New York, I think one in somewhere in China, maybe Hong Kong. But that's where most of the gold is. And that's what makes gold super centralized, is that, and banks obviously take advantage by fractional reserve lending it. The current banking regime is a complete bastardization of what it was meant to be, which was to secure people's gold. Now it's become like this facility to create extra money for people on behalf of people. They're to credit card services and buying, supporting the economy. It's essentially an extension of the government. So the question really is about what is the future of banking? What actual value can they provide to Bitcoiners? Because you can be your own bank. Well, there are a couple things. They can sort of take on that security role, but I think that's being more or less farmed out right now to places like Unchained and Casa and hardware wallets, and they know security better and they can give you the tools to secure it yourself. The other function that banks have is this ability to match sort of borrowers and lenders, borrowers and people that want interest or investors. That hasn't been the case for a while, right? Like, investors just go and borrow money that's printed instead of borrowing money that someone is saving. So I think that function comes in a lot more, but like while fiat money and like money creation is happening, that's not a function anyone's going to really want, because you're always going to be able to get loans at a much lower interest rate from newly printed money. So that's ultimately, I think, where Bitcoin, like banking, what it becomes. But right now, like the main function that they serve is, I think, what you're saying. People just don't like learning about how to secure their own stuff, having personal responsibility, securing their own banks, basically, right? Like nobody does that, except for people that know custody their own keys and so on. That's the direction that we're, I think, moving in, but the rest of banking, I don't think is useful.
Okay, I'd like to say something here, because I know where Jimmy is, and I want to bring out the idea of my understanding of banking. What you're describing, Jimmy, is really like gold warehousing. What you're really describing is Bitcoin warehousing. And then the other thing that you've described is savings and loan. I have this, and you can, the gold with the Bitcoin, and you can borrow it because I have it. I'm foregoing buying a new car so you can have one now. And so I get the interest. And those are all legitimate things that have happened in the past. The gold standard, and I think where the Bitcoin standard will go and has to go, is we have to create the marketplace where the market actually allows the money supply to grow and contract on demand. And it represents not just Bitcoin, but gold and all the other wealth creation out there. Now,
but okay, hold on.
Yes.
This is a very contentious and difficult issue, because basically the major selling point of Bitcoin, or one of the leading pitches for Bitcoin, is that you can't contract or expand the money supply. The whole point is that it's scarce.
but what you're describing is a warehouse function. And that's or 100%, and that's fine. I get it.
It's not the supply of the money itself, it's the supply of people willing to lend it. That's a little bit different.
Or credit.
Right.
It's about, and as interest goes up, there's more people that are willing to lend. As interest goes down, there's less. And that expansion and contraction of credit available.
So we're talking about credit liquidity.
Well, we're talking about non-producers. You're talking about it. I'm not producing anything. I want to get something, and he has the asset that is not banking. That's the old savings and loan program.
Right.
The banking was the actual what you created new purchasing media that represented all the new goods, the producers in society. And that was the secret. That was the innovation that they developed during the Gilded Age. And it was that was then adopted and nationalized. And this is what I think is the missing ingredient. Until we develop this side by side, okay, we have the ultimate gold now. I mean, basically, a thing that's far superior to gold. But we actually have a market mechanism that can also, once it becomes a standard, it's going to represent all the wealth that comes into play in society. So yes, you may want to have more Bitcoin, but you may want to get whatever the new widget is or invention is tomorrow. Now, obviously, somebody that was a banker that was banked for buggy whips at the turn of the century, that was a difficult banking thing because the buggy whip demand went down, and there were buggy whips everywhere without any function. So there is such thing as making bad loans. And when that happened, then those gold reserves were taken out, and the market figured it out because it was the bankers themselves that were watching each other. As when we centralized that's when it started falling apart.
Aleks, you actually have probably very interesting insights on this. I'm not familiar with Amber's sort of custody model, but it's obvious there's some multi-sig custody models for this. On-chain capital has like a 2 of 3. You collateralize, you kind of basically collateralize the Bitcoin in multi-sig, and then you can get a fiat loan, right? Which lets you play that spread, and that's a very interesting reason to actually enter a semi-custodial relationship with a company. How do you see this discussion in terms of like creating or giving access to loans and liquidity to the market through collateralized Bitcoin?
I mean, that as I said, that's one of the transitions towards not needing to do that anymore.
You myself.
This one. This one works?
Yeah.
That's all transitional. So to give you an idea, like our job as a Bitcoin business is to, like, our mission is to help people accumulate long-term wealth in the form of Bitcoin. Now, the fact exists that today they need to still interact with other people, and they have have goods and services and things that they need to buy, which are fundamentally denominated in fiat, and the counterparty, the merchant, is accepting only fiat. So we need to still bridge that gap, and that's part of the transitionary thing. But our goal is to find a way to provide that service in a way that's commercial and that leverages the technology that Bitcoin has to make it easy. So like we partner, for example, with Unchained Capital. We're one of their earliest partners, and when people come and download Ammous for the first time, they have no idea about what the fuck a Bitcoin wallet is, or seed phrase, or self-custody, or any of that. So over 75% of our users, we actually abstract good custody principles for them by storing 100% of that Bitcoin across Unchained multi-sig vaults. So we actually give them the benefit of multi-sig storage of Bitcoin, but we absorb the cost of doing that because we do it in full capacity, and we make money off the actual brokerage fee when people move from dollars into Bitcoin. So that's our role. And then what we want to do then with the buy now pay later thing that we're building is we want to then help people avoid ever having to sell Bitcoin, because again, the core mission is build long-term wealth.
But Aleks, what you're talking about is a warehousing operation. It's just you're warehousing Bitcoin. And what I'm trying to get here is there's a big distinction between banking and warehousing. And it's hard to understand it. And I wish Galt could get kind of, because I know it's a concept, and I know particularly those that come from the anarcho-capitalist background and Murray Rothbard thinking. I mean, he actually wrote a book called The Case for 100% Gold Standard. When I read that book, I called him out. I called him, you're a gold socialist, because you want to force the gold standard on everyone, and you want to make it a warehousing operation. He never understood what the gold standard was. And I don't think we understand what the Bitcoin standard will be. Because if we have the standard of value, Bitcoin's just going to be the standard of all the value. It's our measuring stick. That's all it is.
How is that not the same as like still in seats on a plane?
Yeah, you gotta go.
Come on.
How is what you're saying not the same as just overselling seats on a plane? Like, they don't have the
Overselling
assets
seats on the
to-
plane.
if they don't have the assets to lend?
Because you're not overselling seeds. Because the wealth, it represents not just the Bitcoin, but represent, in other words, the assets were actually, they use bill of ladings, okay? The bank owned your production. They created the money so you could pay your suppliers, pay your employees. As those people got those funds, it was self-liquidating. They could buy not just Bitcoin, but whatever else they wanted. And those notes would be retired. It's called self-liquidating commercial paper. And that was the innovation of the 19th century. Most gold standard advocates never understood it.
Okay, so to bring it to the era we're in, we have this fundamentally scarce monetary asset, speculative sort of digital gold, right? That's trying to be money and it's probably going to become money. And we have a world that is entirely used to fiat currency and fractional banking and sort of money by will, right? And it's addicted to it as well, right? Like the whole world is on that train, right? So I think it brings the question of fractional Bitcoin banking, fractional Bitcoin reserve structures. There's probably already exchanges doing this, right? Pretending they have more assets than they actually have. And if they're not doing it, somebody's going to do it at some point. How does that work? Maybe Tony, you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. The fractional reserve model that we're used to is just, it's been taken to its absolute critical limits. And we can also say that, well, eventually it was going to get there anyway, no matter how you fractionally reserve. But having credit is going to be problematic because I can certainly make an argument that we're sitting here today where we are is because of the credit system over the last 40, 50 years. Like maybe the internet would have not taken off if it wasn't for the ability to create credit out of thin air backed by a small percentage. So it is a bit controversial, but there was reasoning behind it. But creating credit, so credit is broken down. Let's break down credit in a couple of ways, right? So you go to the bank to get credit. The bank creates money out of thin air to give you the money. There is really, you can break it down into three forms. One of them is you're trying to start a business. This is the best form of money creation credit. The bank does an assessment. What is the probability that this business is going to add more value to the world? You become wealthier, you pay back the bank with interest. And everybody wins and everyone benefits, jobs get created, everything is great. Those are the kinds of fiat credit money creation that's good for the world. Now the more neutral one is I'm going to the bank to borrow money to build a house or buy a house. Now you're just deferring your money. It's like, all right, I have a job, I'm earning money, I'm going to pay this with interest because I have income. Lending for you to buy a house creates a little bit of jobs because someone has to build the house and there is some economic activity generated, but nowhere near to the point of building a business. Now the worst type of credit, like lending, is government lending. This is what's killing the world. What's killing the world is governments not able to spend within their means. So I don't really have a huge problem with credit and fractional reserve lending when it comes to creation of private businesses. But I have a huge problem when it comes to government bonds and funding the government. So how do you get rid of that really bad one, but still having a system where money can get kind of printed out of thin air as long as it's used for good things, which is private citizens creating businesses. And I know Jimmy's gonna hate me for saying it because you guys are gonna be like, no, you can't create any money out of thin air. And I can say, yeah, but then we could still be living on a gold standard without electricity.
They actually, again, there are so many of these debates were, there was one over the fractional reserve, and Henry Hazlitt, he wrote, he was against any fractional reserve, but it was fixed fractional reserve. If you set that fixed at a 20% reserve, well, why couldn't it be 30? Or why couldn't it be 80? And that's why it's the fixing of that reserve that's the problem. You don't want a fixed reserve. The marketplace can actually determine the reserve. And it's a hard concept to learn, but it actually, the marketplace can literally increase and decrease the market supply depending upon the market demand. But it has to be an ideal free market.
I want to frame this just so it's easier to understand for people in terms that might be familiar with. It sounds to me like it's not that different from taking, let's say, a leveraged trade where you have a certain amount of collateral and you're taking a bigger position by assuming a certain amount of risk. A bank sounds like it's a similar process, right? The bank would sort of have a certain amount of collateral, they would be able to provide liquidity to an investment bet.
A bank can wrongly collateralize a loan. They can overestimate, say, well, we think this product, we'll loan you this value, and they just, you know, budget which used to be worth this amount, and all of a sudden, the value fell out of bed. So, yeah, so those are real risks, and they happen, but what happens is that bank then becomes suspect, and their reserves are drawn upon. Nobody's going to keep, the other bankers are the ones that keep the bank honest. It's when we nationalize that system that all the problems and the special privileges started coming into line. But it was a market that actually grew organically.
And it's self-regulated. So I agree with you. So I actually used to make the point that fractional reserve would be, would end up emerging anyway, but it would self-regulate to a point in which risk was managed. But
right, as long as the fractional reserve doesn't give government the ability to print money for themselves, and I don't care if they borrow it or print it, it doesn't matter, right? As long as the fractional reserve is used for private businesses and free market, I don't see it as a bad thing.
There's an extension to this though. So me, Saifedean, Alan Farrington, and Harris Irfan were on the call together. And we did a clubhouse which was called Bitcoin as Sharia compliant money. And under Sharia law, for example, there is no capacity to lend. And in that model of the world, what we were discussing there is that fractional reserve lending may voluntarily, under a free market and a hard money standard or a fixed money standard, actually converge to no fractional reserve, because on a Sharia type money, what you do is instead of lending, you actually, the lender becomes an equity partner, so you actually get skin in the game for new enterprises. So instead of going to a bank and borrowing money that might be fractionally reserved, you go to a bank and they actually co-invest into your venture with you, which is a different relationship. It's not a debtor-creditor relationship. It's a partner equity relationship. So this is like, I don't think we yet understand how credit will be affected on Bitcoin.
I think you guys are crazy. I don't think fractional reserve deserves any kind of excuse, because really what you're saying is banks should be allowed to be insolvent. If they're insolvent, they should go bankrupt. There's a word, that word has the word bank in it for a reason. It has that word in it because banks are by nature bankrupt, right? Like this has been happening for hundreds of years. And once you start down that road of fractional reserve, what you get is temptation to fractionally reserve more and more, and you get bailouts, and you get you essentially end up with fiat money. This is exactly what happened with us. Let me finish. The reason why we got to the fiat money that we have now is because all of these banks kept fractionally reserved, they fractionally reserved lend like crazy. And at a certain point, they were like, okay, we got to help all of these people that lost their shirt in this fractional reserve bank that went bankrupt and was overdrawn or whatever. We feel really bad for them. We're going to centralize and make a central bank, a bank for banks, a lender of last resort. This is how we got to the system that we have right now. I don't think fractional reserve banking has any place. Now, that's not to say that somebody's not going to try it. Of course someone's trying it. I mean, Mount Galt did it. There's a lot of other places that are doing it. But the way you learn not to put your money into insolvent places is by suffering, right? Is by being, let me finish. It is by suffering, it is by being screwed over. And that's how you learn not to put your trust in these places. It's a single point of failure. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think there's any place for that in this economy.
Do you use a credit card?
I do, but I'm trying to get off.
Right. So
This is why we're having this conversation, evidently. There's a lot of room for in-house debate, and I knew we were going to get into this one with Jimmy, so that's great.
So, how does a credit card work? How does a credit card allow you to spend money? Right? The credit card actually creates that money out of thin air. It's fractionally reserved. Now, the credit card has a very high interest for when you don't pay. Because a credit card company doesn't want to go insolvent. So, the credit card company has a job. They can't give you too much credit on your credit card. And they charge you a big interest. But if you pay on time, how does a credit card company make money? Well, they charge a fee to the merchant. So we already have a banking system of fractional reserve that has been fairly functional for a while in the private sector.
I don't think it's functional. And a lot of that money is created out of things.
No, it all is, right? But when you pay the credit card back, that money is canceled, right? The credit card creates money out of thin air. It allows you to buy your goods. You pay the credit card back, that gets canceled. So this is a good example of money creation that is run properly because they have a stream of income of a percentage from businesses that accept credit card payments, and then for those that don't pay the credit card on time, they have a high interest. Now the credit card companies could be irresponsible and give everyone 12 years and up $300 million worth of credit line, but they don't. They try to be responsible, and people try to game the system by getting credit, maxing out their credit cards, buying Bitcoin, not paying them back. That's why everyone else pays a high interest when they don't pay. So there is a market for properly run fractional reserve, as long as the government's not involved.
I think it's completely immoral. What you're doing is you're diluting the monetary base for the sake of the credit card borrower. And I don't think that's right. Why do the people that have high credit scores get access to this money where other people don't?
I'm going to change the
They're
subject.
responsible up to that point in life.
But why does that bank get to print extra money or
They're not
existence
printing
that
money,
is
but
extra?
if it's collateralized with the new goods coming in production.
All right, if it's collateralized, then that's a different thing.
That's what I'm
But
saying.
what Tone's talking about is an uncollateralized loan. It has no backing.
I'm not talking about uncollateralized, I'm talking about collateralized.
I'm arguing with
Well,
you. So
yeah.
basically, if it's uncollateralized, it's ex nihilo. It comes out of nothing. If it comes out of nothing, it is newly printed money, and that is evil. And we know it's evil because of all of the stuff that's been going
Okay,
on.
hold on. So let's say that a good friend comes to you and says, hey, listen, I have this idea for a company, right? A project. He tells you about it. You find it worth a certain amount of risk, worth a certain amount of capital, and then you decide to invest in that with certain terms, right? So you're providing liquidity and capital, and that works because there's a potential where it could become a thing, but there's also risk to fail there. Is that creating money? Is that
No, that's not creating money, but I am foregoing the opportunity cost of using my money in order for my friend to go start the business. With a credit card loan, ex nihilo loans, right, mortgage loans, all of these other loans, most of the loans that exist in the economy today, there's no opportunity cost for anybody. Think about like a 30-year mortgage, right? You get a 30-year mortgage at 3%, right? That's sort of the going rate. If you're on the other side of that trend, would you ever make it? No, hell no. You have credit risk, you're getting only 3%, and it's a 30-year term. There is no way in the world anyone would take that trade. But it happens all day long. Why? Because it is new money that is being printed into existence every day. And that is evil. And like this
No, but that happens because of government's involvement and government backing. If banks could actually go bust, if they were responsible, this would not be 30 years, this would be 10 years, like 100 years ago, and the interest rate would not be 3%, it'd be closer to 9%.
Yeah, and it has been. And they have gone bankrupt, and a lot of people have been screwed. The thing is, like, with money, when we're talking about money, in a fiat money standard, what everyone is forced to do is to risk everything, right? Like constantly be at risk of default in some way because you're putting your money at risk. You have to forego sort of like opportunity costs, or you have to get a loan in order to like mitigate that. But you're forced to be a risk taker all over the place. With sound money, you don't have to do that, and that's what money is supposed to be. Instead, money has become this thing where if you don't put it to work, right? If you're not putting some risk into your money, then nothing is going to work, right? You're going to fall behind, and you're going to be like dead on a treadmill.
And that's an area where Bitcoin is fundamentally different than obviously than every other fiat currency. You can't create more Bitcoin, no matter what. And with the current system and all the problems you guys have talked about is, the government gets to create more money basically, right? Practically speaking. How does this work when you can't create more money? Because I mean, one thing is to say that it's evil, and it may be evil, let's say that it is, but it's not gonna matter if most people disagree with us, or they're just, the laws of the land are that, yeah, you can issue credit, you can do this, right? And so if loans and contracts are denominated in Bitcoin, because that's the most valuable money and people are like throwing the paper out the window because it's useless, then now with Bitcoin denominated loans and credit, how could that play out? How would that...
More shitcoins?
Yeah, I want to address that because I think one of the things that we've ignored so far is the actual condition of Bitcoin banking today, and it sucks because it is the exchanges, and basically it's all shitcoins. And that's really the immediate problem that has to be addressed. And we need something truly new.
The market is used to credit, and if Bitcoin doesn't provide a mechanism for that credit, shitcoins become that credit.
That's the reality. Yeah.
And and that's sad because it's very difficult for a true Bitcoin exchange. If you notice, there's some decent, I consider decent exchanges. They want nothing to do with this conference. I guarantee you.
All right,
we can kind of see at Unchained Capital what a Bitcoin lending market looks like. They charge 11, 12, 13%. And that's because they fully collateralize it. It is very hard to get those loans, and it's going to probably stay that way because if you don't have the Bitcoins, it's not yours, and there's significant risk. So you're, and that's probably the more normal.
So that's interesting. So you don't believe that what Unchained Capital is doing is the same thing as what you're saying?
No, it's collateralized, and
but it's not fully collateralized, right? Like there is some leverage.
No, it's all fully collateralized.
It's 100%. It's actually
You can see it
over-collateralized.
on chain
That's
every
true.
time.
It's over-collateralized.
Which is why it's a high interest rate and why it could be challenging for them to compete with like shitcoins and their competitors that have shitcoins.
Okay, I just want to say one more thing before we... Rob, can I just quickly throw this one in? So, to Jimmy's point, like, beyond... So, what Tone's saying is that people are going to go and create credit, and they will, and they're going to credit expansion, contraction, all that sort of stuff. But to Jimmy's point, like, even beyond being modeled, over a long enough time frame, enough people will go bankrupt And when you like, because fractional reserve will always be subject to someone trying to end up being insolvent and actually, fucking it up for everybody else. When you measure that against an asset or a money that is actually increasing in purchasing power naturally, with alongside the increase in productive capacity of humanity, you actually eliminate the need to do fractional reserve. You actually eliminate the need of this idea of placing money somewhere for an interest rate return. Like so Jimmy's point is that savings is actually incentivized as opposed to having to store your money somewhere so that it can be on lend and doing all this other stuff. So I think Bitcoin changes the paradigm in such a deep way that I don't know whether it's compatible long-term with fractional reserve. Not to say that fractional reserve won't happen along the way, but it'll converge to being a dumb thing to do, and the market will make it obsolete because you've got a money that is appreciating.
Now, commercial banking is not perfectly, but as perfectly as can be done in a marketplace, is fully reserved, but it's not reserved necessarily with gold or Bitcoin. It's reserved, but you're using Bitcoin or gold or whatever that standard is as your measuring stick. And the money creation represents the new one. You can make a wrong estimate on what, I'm talking about producers, guys, and this is why I say the next major move has to come from producers. And Hayek writes about it in denaturalization of money. He never talks. He says, I don't think it's going to be used as cash. At least not for a long time. It's going to be done by merchants internationally, and that's exactly where we are.
Yeah, guys, and keep in mind, like, when we talk about fractional reserve banking, it's a giant wide gap between, something like Canada's doing with a 0% reserve. US has like a 5% reserve, and credit cards are generally like, 70-80% reserve, right? So there's a huge discrepancy there of which ones are more responsible and which ones are not.
I think it's a slippery slope. You don't want to go down that slippery slope, and you end up with fiat money. The beginning is like fractional reserve, the end is fiat money. That's how it always has ended up. This is why gold didn't work, and this is why, like, if we're going to have any hope for Bitcoin, it has to be decentralized. You have to hold your own keys, and you have to, like, and if there is going to be a lending market, it's not going to be centralized on some exchange, but you do peer-to-peer lending with a marketplace order where you say, okay, I want to loan for this much, I have this credit rating from this agency that you might trust, and based on that, you get a loan from the marketplace from somebody directly instead of somebody.
Credit rating is not collateralization. I make a distinction. As long as it's collateralized with other goods, that's a big difference.
It could be collateralized at 50% or something like that, right? And that's a risk that people might be willing to take. And if it's a market transaction, I'm fine with that. What I object to is this idea that that creating new money out of thin air for some entrepreneurial endeavor is a good thing, because it's they're building a house and therefore it's good. It might be a very crappy house. It might not even work. It might be a scam. There is no guarantee that whatever they build out of the extra money that you create out of the fractional reserve is going to be useful. And in fact, it generally tends not to be if it's someone else's money. All evidence suggests that if it's your own money, you tend to be a lot more careful with it. And this is something that I've learned, like, in the VC industry, right? Like, if you get a VC's money, you're going to have, pool tables and, lunches and everything provided. But if it's your own money, you're going to be like, I don't know. I don't think we should provide that benefit. It's only because everyone else is doing it that you're forced to do it.
Okay, Jimmy, I have an example. I purchased an upfront program, Jade. I bought 500 Jades. I got them here because I paid whatever their full pre-order price is. Okay, incidentally, we have Jades for $70 back there.
We got the Blockstream hardware wallets, Jade. So speaking of being your own bank, you can be your bank.
That's a good tool to do that.
That's right. So Jimmy's gonna, he knows that. I haven't even opened it up yet. He's got it way beyond me. But Jimmy, okay, so here we have all these Jades. They've got all their help they've got to pay for. They got to pay for this material. It's going to take time for them to go from this real product, okay, that's going to take 90 days for them to distribute it throughout the world. But in the meantime, they have these expenses. And what the way banking works, yes, the banking function, okay, we're going to credit you this amount. It's not created out of nothing. The collateralized are the J wallets. It's fully collateralized with the J wallets. The money is created so they can pay their help, they can pay their suppliers. And as those J wallets are sold, those notes are retired. That is non-inflationary.
That's what I was talking about. It's no money out of thin air.
Because that's how the entire fiat system's been running for the entire time. The thing is, there's a tendency for the debt level in aggregate to continuously increase. And this is how federal money, US dollar, every central bank money, monetary expansion has happened. You might retire when it gets paid back, but there's a time difference, and as more people borrow more and more money, and as goods get more and more expensive, you need more and more credit, and this is essentially what happens. But regardless, I think even if it's fully collateralized, unless somebody is giving up their opportunity cost of their money, it is immoral to lend it out. You can't create money just because there's collateral. I mean, that's still saying, okay, you can go and sell that thing and get that money and then go buy it back after you're done. I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it. Instead, it's just like creating credit because there happens to be collateral and like expanding the money supply for that reason, I still think is evil. I still think that's bad. Somebody needs to give up their opportunity cost of the Bitcoins that they are lending to you in order for it to be more.
Well, and
That's
the
why
hard-
equity.
We had a question. Sorry about that.
So the hard reality is that Bitcoin, yeah, you can come up with it. I'm just going to say, like, the hard reality is that Bitcoin we can't expand the supply of Bitcoin. If you have a custodial service, there's games they can play that are dirty. I think they should be disclosing that for sure. But if you don't have the Bitcoin to lend it out or invest it, even if there's collateral, like if somebody's using a house as collateral or something like that, if you don't have the Bitcoin to lend it out, you literally can't send it to people to be spent.
Plus, you can have
a separate
side-by-side operations. You can have what Jim is talking about, custodial, a warehousing operation. Would you want to protect your hodl?
But then
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, but
you can take a small part of your hodl. This is my hodl. This is my I'm warehousing it myself, or I can pay somebody to warehouse it for me.
Yeah, but that only works if you have a centralized payments system as well, where everything can settle in the background.
It's like having your gold stash, okay? Same thing. But if you take, but now we're creating, the gold is held, and it's not even a thing, the problem was not the reserve, it was fixing the reserve. It was an arbitrary imposed. And the banks are always under regulation where you have to hold so much of these bonds, or whatever it was.
Imposed by the government.
Yes.
Right.
And the commercial, the
Well, I
gold
think the limit will be imposed by the Bitcoin protocol itself, and that's sort of where the market will probably end up playing
you
out.
can still warehouse your own gold. People had gold coins, but they didn't transact in gold with those gold coins, but they did transact with gold notes.
Just before you go, and I'll let you definitely ask your question. We're technically coming up on break now, lunch break. I think this conversation is really good. So
Just two questions.
You can dismiss them later.
We'll be covering the whole thing tomorrow and pretty much everybody.
Great.
But I'm curious. So let's say, like, in the context of future banking, we're talking about a digital environment. We're talking about fractional reserve in this environment with Bitcoin. So if Vitalik today created a wrapped BTC sidechain and said it was worth one Bitcoin, in fact, like it's 1-to-1 Bitcoin, and either sold 100 of them or loaned out 100 of them, whether or not he's making interest on 100 or he's directly sold 100. But then we find out and audit the address that's actually backing this, and there's only 70. Do we call that a scam or not? And if we do, how is that any functionally different than fractional reserve?
No, that is going to be a scam. If you're representing this and it's that, but that's not what banking did. What they did is, it was the merchants themselves. It wasn't even, the merchants created this new thing and it became a bank. They did it themselves and say, you know what, I'm not really good at this, but we'll put this guy in charge. And they watched each other.
I still don't think that's legit, or I think that's just asking for trouble. What you're getting is an insolvent organization the minute you create money out of thin air. That's
But
but his example is instructive. You have wrapped Bitcoin. If you issue more wrapped Bitcoin than you have actually in an address, then you are insolvent. That at the minute you create even a little bit more Bitcoin, than there exists, then you have actually in reserve. You are insolvent. In insolvency, if you're insolvent, you're committing fraud. That's what you're doing.
So I'll answer it a little bit differently, right? It depends where the money went. When you said is that a scam, right? Because that is how the current fiat system works. Now, if he created the 100 wrapped Bitcoin claiming it was backed by 100, and it was really backed by 70, what happened to that 30 fractionally reserved coins? Now, if Vitalik gave it to himself and friends like he did the first time, that is obviously a scam. But, and here's the thing, based the way our financial system works, if he has the best company to assess risk, and he has metrics that would pay all of that 100 coins back, and that 100 wrapped Bitcoin was loaned out in a responsible way that would generate, that would, in its best efforts, help society without the involvement of government, and that economic activity generates 100 Bitcoin of value that gets paid back to Vitalik to pay back the full 100 while he keeps a small percentage on doing a good job on that 30% fractional reserve. That may not necessarily be a scam in today's society because that's how today's society is supposed to function.
I feel like
That's the morality.
I feel like there's a couple of things that, like, when I try to take this back to the base, when we're talking about the resources, that still doesn't add up. One is Vitalik is able to make a higher interest on a larger pool of resources than actually exists. And then two, in the context of the loan, if you're creating money for a loan to go do something, I think the scam becomes obvious when we talk about defaulting on the loan. If somebody creates $200,000 out of thin air that they don't actually have for me to buy a house, and then I default, they get my house. Which means they printed the ownership of a house out of thin air.
Yes.
And I now owe them a house that they never owned to begin with. They never created the production. They created the money for which my house is now, like they bought themselves a house for free.
Right, and this is where regulation is supposed to, prevent banks from these kinds of predatory practices to print themselves houses. And one other mention on that, also, like, I don't know why we're using Vitalik's name, but like that random person, right? Also remember, this random person doing this is not going to be some broke bum. Remember, modern day banking was basically started by J.P. Morgan himself, who was one of the most wealthiest individuals. And it was his responsibility to keep the banking system alive, or he loses his entire fortune, his entire wealth, right? So if at that point, if we are going to use Vitalik as an example, who's a billionaire, if Vitalik's $1 billion is on the line to make sure this 30% of this 100 Bitcoin is properly managed, then there actually is skin in the game for this structure to benefit society.
So all of that you guys have been saying are extremely subjective, right? It's like, oh well, if somehow it gets paid back, it might be like is gambling like a reasonable way if you can pay back the extra 30 Bitcoin by gambling it, and you have maybe you have a system that works with blackjack at some casino, right? Like. It's not about being paid back or about like what the intent of the person that's borrowing it is. It is fundamentally evil because you're creating new money out of existence and you are insolvent as the corporation that's holding these funds. And that in itself is evil. There is no excuse to ever print money, period.
Out of nothing, ex nihilo.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, and
Ex
doing
nihilo.
it, even if you collateralize it, unless somebody gives up their opportunity cost, it is completely and utterly
No, it's
insolvent.
not ex nihilo anymore. I agree with you, ex nihilo.
No, it is ex nihilo though.
Well-
Like that, because you're creating the money out of nothing, even if it's collateralized, unless somebody is giving you a loan out of their savings in order for them to get it, like and you're not, if you're creating it,
Their
that's
savings is what they're producing, Jimmy.
What?
Their savings is what they just produced. It
No,
could
but
be
you can't
corn.
print, new money
You
because you're
can't,
diluting
you can't
everything
put
else.
it new corn or raise new beef, but it's still a real asset, isn't it?
What's that?
To the point, to like what Ugly's saying, it's like, couldn't a business just, instead of loaning some sort of like IOUs for something, can they actually loan the resources they have idle, like they loan a tractor?
They're collateralizing the money creation with the wealth that they produce. It is not ex nihilo. I agree with this ex nihilo argument. I don't agree with those applications.
Well, even if it's collateralized, if you're creating new money, it's ex
Can you
nihilo.
explain what ex nihilo means? I have no idea.
Out of nothing. That's what in Latin. That's what it means.
It's
Out
not
of
saying
nothing.
that if it's collateralized, it's not being created out of nothing. There's a hard asset behind the
Not at the time,
But the money
time
that's
of the
actually
loan.
created is ex nihilo. That's
It's
the
a-
thing.
In other words, it's a
Example-
measurement. You're using Bitcoin or using gold as the yardstick, and it acts as a governor over the banking.
Money is fundamentally confidence in the asset that you're using to measure the economic activity. So when you create money, money is useless without the confidence that you place on it as a way of measuring economic engagement, right? I think in a Bitcoin standard, because you can't create more Bitcoin, the only way that you can actually practically do this is you create a shitcoin that's a vehicle for spending, and that's all.
That's what everyone's been
That's
doing.
what they're doing.
And that's what they're doing.
Welcome to
It's
the
not
crypto
representing,
space,
it's
right?
not
In that
representing,
sense,
the
all
new
credit
production
is
is,
Bitcoin.
the new production is, that's not a real asset. It's not corn, it's not beef, it's not a cage.
But the reason why the credit creation through shitcoins is so much worse than fractional reserve lending is because with fractional reserve lending, there are some mechanisms to pay back that money. With shitcoins, there is literally zero. So if Bitcoin, this is my view, this is why I don't just shit on the fractional reserve creation, because in a world without it, it's worse. It's the shitcoin world with zero mechanism to pay anything back.
Not only that, there's zero judgment as to, there's nobody
The
in
market
Ethereum
will come up with something. I don't think it's going to be zero. But
Market did, it was sound commercial banking, self-liquidating commercial papers, what the market developed.
Well, but regardless, like the point here is that in of itself, if you're creating money, if someone is loaning you Bitcoin that they have in exchange with taking the truck as collateral or whatever item, that is fine. But if you're creating new money because of this collateral, that is not.
Jimmy's spot on there. That's exactly what I was about to say. So it's not actually the creation of new money. All it is, it's the transfer of it. And this is what comes back to my point earlier is I think long term, nobody in their right mind is actually going to transfer their Bitcoin for any other fucking collateral. So what it's going to do is it's going to change the credit debt relationship between people. And if you want to create something new, it's actually going to be an equity relationship. No one is going to say, I'll give you my Bitcoin for 10%, because the chances are you run off with that Bitcoin as well or something happens. So you will get into an equity relationship with people. The idea of loaning your Bitcoin for an interest rate, I think, is going to dissipate.
And 50 years ago, there was a big distinction between banking now is just crazy, but there used to be actual savings and loans where savings were used to buy houses or to buy a car. Unless the money was saved there, you couldn't borrow it. But there's a different function from banking. Two different things. And in commercial banking, it was actually created by the merchants so they could collateralize, they could use their collateral of new production so they could pay their employees, pay their suppliers, and yes, it's not inflationary money creation because it contracts. The problem is, when Jimmy said, well, they don't let it contract, that is the problem.
We got one last question real quick. And also, initially when fiat was created, there were hard mechanisms to make sure the money gets paid back. There used to be debtor prisons to make sure that people...
That wasn't fiat money though, that was under a hard gold standard, yeah.
So this kind of goes along with that. I think it's really hard to even compare the two when we're talking about fiat money and the way that fiat money works versus a hard currency like gold or like Bitcoin. So when we're trying to compare how the two work, it's hard to wrap your head around. But I do. This kind of goes back to the last panel, but they went off topic. But what being that Bitcoin, if Bitcoin becomes the standard, right? It's being used as a standard in multiple different ways. Lightning Network is a great example of that, or Liquid, or even like Coinbase, they do custodial services, these custodial wallets, or Cash App, or Amber.app. This sounds really cool. What's happening here? It's like a secured credit card, secured with Bitcoin. But why couldn't you do that with the next, take it to the next level? Have a secured, an unsecured credit card, right? Fractional reserve credit card, but it's being paid off every month, and the reserve is basically to cover. A certain number of people are going to be paying interest on that. I don't think it makes any. The problem is it actually makes no sense to take loans in Bitcoin. It just doesn't, because it's not inflationary. You want to borrow, and this is a whole Michael would say with them. But I just wanted to throw that out there. If there was a credit card like that, I don't think there would be really any issue with that. It's really just a payment movement. And companies like Coinbase and Cash App are moving Bitcoin around all over the place. No Bitcoin are moving from wallets when that's happening. Same thing on the Lightning Network.
All right, I think we're already cut into lunchtime. We may have to take that discussion offline.
Yeah, so, I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts. Max Kaiser says something which always kind of sticks with me, which is that capitalism requires capital. And how we continue to play that game and how we solve the problem of investing in the future and building, I think, especially with Bitcoin as a treasury asset, with Bitcoin as entrepreneurs using Bitcoin as part of their leverage over the economy, it's gonna have a big impact in the future. So thanks everybody for participating.
I'll go back to that debtor prison thing. Those are the lengths they had to go to back then because there was no. It's a tough conversation.
That's not a bad thing.
But those were the lengths to go to get people to part with their gold.